My sister demanded I quit my job to watch her kids for free. My parents found out whose name was on their lease. My sister made her announcement before the food was even on the table.
Quit your job.
Watch my kids. That's your contribution to this family. My mother agreed. My father called me selfish when I said no. I set my fork down and I walked out, and I did not explain myself. By Monday morning, they had called my workplace to create a problem for me. What they found instead was a conversation with a property management company and the name on the lease to the house they had been living in for 4 years without ever thinking to ask who held it. That name was mine.
House.
Subscribe and hit the bell. New stories every week. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, and events are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental. Hashtag family revenge, hashtag she finally said no, hashtag family drama, hashtag true story time, hashtag housing reality. Section 4, full story. My name is Ren Castillo. I'm 29 years old. And the Friday evening my sister made her announcement before I had even unfolded my napkin was when I finally understood that some people will ask you to hand over your whole life and call it a contribution. She did not build to it. She stood at the kitchen table of the family house, the house I am going to tell you about, and she said it the way you say something you have already decided, something that has been agreed upon in rooms you were not invited into. Quit your job. You're watching my kids. That's your contribution to this family. My mother, across the table, nodded. She needs you more than that company does. My father said nothing for a moment. Then, in the deliberate register he used for conclusions, you've always been too selfish to show up for us. I set my fork down on the table. I picked up my bag from the back of my chair. I walked to the door, and I left. I drove home in the particular quiet of a decision that has been made and does not require discussion, and I did not call anyone, and I did not respond to the 3 texts that came in before I reached my apartment. What none of them knew, what I had not told them, because I had learned what telling them things produced, was that the house they were sitting in, the house my parents had lived in for 4 years and my sister treated as a permanent fixture of her life, was leased in my name, not their name.
Meaning?
The property management company's records listed 1 leaseholder, 1 guarantor, 1 person responsible for the monthly payment and the annual renewal and the condition of the property at the end of the term. That person was me. My sister was going to call my workplace on Monday morning. I did not know that yet. But when she did, the call she received in return was not the one she had planned for. Let me tell you how we got here, because the house did not arrive in my name by accident, and the family did not arrive at that dinner table without history. My parents, Gloria and Ernesto Castillo, had rented for their entire adult lives in a city on the southern end of a state that had become, over the decades they had been there, significantly more expensive than the one they had arrived in. They were not irresponsible people. They were people who had worked steadily and spent carefully and raised 2 children and saved in the modest and practical way that people who do not have financial advisors save, in an account that grew slowly and was available if something went wrong. The something that went wrong was not a single event but a series of them. Ernesto's back injury in his 53rd year, which reduced him from full-time to part-time work over 18 months, the increase in their rent that came with the turnover of their building's ownership, the gap between what they had saved and what it cost to keep the life they had in the city they had built it in. I was 24 when my mother called me and said, in the way she said difficult things, matter of fact, in the middle of a longer conversation, as though she were reporting weather, that they were going to have to move. Their lease was ending. The new rate was $230 more per month than the old one, and the landlord had not negotiated. They had looked at other options. The options were farther from the neighborhood they had been in for 11 years, farther from the church and the market, and the routes my father could still drive, and the particular configuration of proximity that constituted their daily life. I had been working for 2 years at that point at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm called Varden and Associates, where I had started as a leasing coordinator and had learned, in the specific way you learn things when you're new and paying attention, how leases worked and what they cost, and where the gaps between what tenants understood and what landlords required tended to produce problems. I was not, at 24, someone with significant financial reserves. I was someone with a salary that was sufficient for my own expenses and a small amount beyond them, and a credit file that was clean because I had been careful, and a professional knowledge of the leasing market that was, in this specific moment, directly relevant. I had found the house on Delgado Street through a property management company called Halverson Residential that Varden and Associates had a professional relationship with. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a neighborhood that was within my parents' existing geography. The monthly rent was $1,460. My parents' combined income, Ernesto's reduced wages and Gloria's part-time work at a school administrative office, covered roughly $1,100 of that. The gap was $360 per month. I had covered the gap from my own account and co-signed the lease as primary leaseholder because my parents' income documentation did not meet Halverson's standalone qualification threshold, and because I was 24 and I believed, the way you believe things at 24 when you have not yet learned to be precise about terms, that this was temporary. My sister, Petra, was 26 at the time. She had 2 children from a relationship that had ended the previous year and was living in a smaller apartment across the city. She did not know I had co-signed the lease. She did not know I was covering the gap. She knew that our parents had moved to Delgado Street and that the house was larger than what they'd had and that the neighborhood was good. She had come to the house for every holiday since the move and had let her children run in the yard and had sat at the kitchen table and eaten meals that my mother cooked and had formed, without ever examining its foundation, the assumption that this was a stable and permanent arrangement that existed independently of anything I was doing. I had not corrected this assumption. I had not, in 4 years, told Petra what my name was on. I had not told Ernesto or Gloria either, beyond what they needed to know at the time of signing. They knew I had helped. They did not know the full structure of what help meant. At Varden and Associates, I was not the person I was at the family table. At Varden, I was precise and fast and, over time, the person who caught the things that other people missed, the clause in a commercial lease that hadn't been updated after a regulatory change, the rent escalation language that would cost a client 3 times what they'd expected in year 4, the renewal option that had a notice window so narrow it was consistently missed. My direct supervisor in those first years was a woman named Lorena Park, who had the particular gift of assigning you the hard thing without preamble and then being available if you needed her, which I came to understand was a form of respect. By the time I was 27, I had moved from leasing coordinator to lease analyst, and by 28, I was the person junior coordinators brought their complicated questions to before they brought them to anyone else. I did not discuss this progression with my family in any detail. My mother knew I worked in real estate. My father knew I dealt with leases. Petra knew I had an office job that paid well enough for me to live alone, which she had mentioned more than once in the particular tone that meant she was comparing it to something. The comparison was to her own situation, which had not stabilized in the 4 years since her relationship ended. She had kept the smaller apartment across the city on a combination of her work income. She managed the front desk at a medical office, and what my parents contributed when they could, which was not regular and was not large. Her children were 4 and 6 by the time of the Friday dinner. She was tired in the specific way of a person who is managing more than they have enough for, and I do not say this to excuse what she asked for. I say it because the structural reason for the cruelty matters, and I knew it even then sitting at the table, and it did not change my answer. What she was asking me to do was absorb the childcare cost that she could not afford by substituting my labor for a paid solution. What she had not done was ask me. She had announced it, in a room where my parents would nod, in the certainty that the family's logic, which had always been that I had more and therefore owed more, would operate the way it always had. She was wrong about what I had. She was also wrong about what I owed. But the specific wrongness that mattered most, the one that was going to become visible in a way I had not arranged and did not need to arrange, was what she did not know about the house she was sitting in. The 3 texts that came in on the drive home were from Petra. I read them at the next light. The first said she couldn't believe I had walked out. The second said that this was exactly what she was talking about, that I never showed up when it mattered. The third said that she and Mom and Dad were going to handle this differently if I wasn't going to be a part of the family. I put my phone in my bag and drove the rest of the way home. In my apartment, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with the window open and the night air coming in off the street, and I thought about the structure of what had happened, which was what I always did when something required a decision. The structure was this. My sister had made a demand that I had refused. My parents had sided with her. She had framed the refusal as evidence of a character flaw, selfishness, absence, failure to show up, and my parents had accepted that frame. None of them had asked what I was already doing because none of them had thought to look. I did not call anyone that night. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I was at my desk at Varden on Monday morning at 8:45. The call to my workplace came at 10:12. I know the time because Lorena Park came to my desk at 10:27 and said, with the particular neutrality she used for things that were unusual and required careful handling, that she had received a call that morning from someone who identified herself as my sister and who had said that I was involved in a family dispute and that the company should be aware of it. I looked at Lorena for a moment. She asked to speak with your supervisor, Lorena said. I told her I was your supervisor and asked how I could help. She said she wanted to report that you were withholding family resources and that she thought your employer should know you weren't a reliable person. What did you say? I asked. I said that employee conduct in personal matters outside work was not within the scope of what I could discuss with third parties, and that if she had a concern about a specific workplace matter, she was welcome to put it in writing to HR. Lorena paused. She asked if you worked with leases. Yes, I said. She said she thought you might be using your position to control a property her parents lived in. Another pause. I told her I couldn't confirm or discuss details of any lease arrangements and that she should speak with the relevant property management company directly. I nodded. Ren, Lorena said. Is there anything I need to know? No, I said. It's a family matter and it's being handled. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to say something else. Then she said, the property management company she'd want to call. Would that be Halverson? Yes, I said. They have your name as primary leaseholder on a residential property. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Let me know if anything changes on the work side. I will, I said. She went back to her office. I returned to the lease analysis I had open on my screen, a commercial renewal with a tenant who had missed the notice window by 11 days and was now in a negotiation that required careful reading of the original agreement's holdover clause. I worked through the rest of the morning without interruption. Petra called Halverson Residential at some point that day. I know this because a leasing agent there named Marcus Finley, whom I had worked with professionally on 2 occasions and who had my contact information as primary leaseholder, sent me a brief email at 4:43 that afternoon. The subject line was, Heads up, inquiry re. Delgado property. The email said that a woman identifying herself as a family member of the residents at the Delgado Street property had called asking about the lease. She had asked who the leaseholder was and whether there was any way to have the lease transferred to the residents directly. Marcus had told her that lease transfers required written consent from the current leaseholder and would need to go through a standard qualification process. She had asked if the current leaseholder was me. Marcus had confirmed my name was on the account, per standard procedure when a caller identifies as a family member of residents. She had said, according to Marcus's note, nothing for several seconds. Then she had asked what would happen to the residents if the lease was not renewed. Marcus had explained the standard process. If the primary leaseholder chose not to renew, residents would receive notice per the lease terms and would need to secure alternative housing. She had thanked him and ended the call. Marcus's email closed with, "No action taken on our end. Just wanted you to know the call came in." I replied, "Thank you for the heads up. No changes to the account at this time." I closed the email. I gathered my things. I drove home. Petra called me at 7:18 that evening. I answered. She was quiet for a moment at the start of the call, the particular quiet of someone who has arrived somewhere they did not expect to be and is working out how to speak from that location. "You're on the lease," she said. "Yes," I said. "You're the leaseholder." "Primary leaseholder and guarantor," I said. "Since the beginning." Another pause. "Mom and Dad don't. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I had thought about how to answer this, because I had known the question was coming since Marcus's email. I gave her the true answer, which was also the short one, because I knew what would happen if I did. Silence on her end. Her breathing was audible. "How long?" she said. For years, I said. Since they moved in. Are you, she stopped. Started differently. Are you going to do something? With the lease? No, I said. I'm not going to do anything with the lease. Mom and Dad's housing is not in question. A breath on her end, released. But I want to be clear about something, I said. I am not going to quit my job. I am not going to provide free childcare. And I am not available to be called selfish by people who don't know what I'm actually doing. She was quiet for a long moment. Her children were audible in the background, small sounds, a television somewhere, the ordinary noise of an evening at her apartment. Okay, she said finally. Her voice was different from the voice at the dinner table. The certainty had gone out of it, and something more uncertain had taken its place, which was not quite an apology, but was not nothing either. Okay, I said. I'll talk to Mom and Dad, she said. That would be good, I said. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with the window open the way I had on Friday evening, the same night air, the same street sounds. I was not thinking about anything specific. I was just sitting in a room that was mine, in a life that was organized the way I had organized it, and I was not changing any of it. The conversation with my parents happened on the following Saturday. Not at the family house, at a coffee place 2 blocks from it, a small spot with outdoor tables and enough ambient noise to make a difficult conversation feel less like an event. My mother arrived first, then my father, then Petra, who sat across from me and looked at the table more than at anyone else. I had decided before I arrived what I was going to say and what I was not. I was not going to present the 4 years as an accusation. I was not going to itemize what the arrangement had cost me. What I was going to do was say the true thing, plainly, and let the room receive it. I told them about the lease. I told them how it had started. My mother's call at 24, the Halverson process, the qualification gap, my name going on as primary leaseholder. I told them that I had been covering the monthly gap between their income and the rent for the duration of the lease. I told them the amount, $360 per month, every month, for 4 years. I did not present the total. I did not need to. My father's coffee cup went still in his hand. My mother looked at me for a long time, without speaking. Then she looked at the table. Petra looked out at the street. Why didn't you tell us? My father said. His voice was low and careful. I told you when it was happening, I said. I told you I was helping and that it was covered. I didn't tell you the full structure, because I didn't think it would stay the way it was for 4 years. I paused. And because I knew that the more the family knew about my finances, the more the family thought it had access to them. He looked at his cup. That's not, he stopped. Friday night, I said. He did not answer. He set his cup down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. I said something that wasn't fair, he said. You did, I said. I'm sorry, he said. He said it the way he said things he meant. Once, without decoration. I know, I said. My mother put her hand on the table, not quite reaching mine, a gesture that stopped partway, uncertain of its welcome. I moved my hand to meet it briefly, and then we both moved our hands back. Petra said to the street, I shouldn't have called your work. No, I said. You shouldn't have. I didn't know, she stopped. I thought you were just not showing up. I thought you had everything and were keeping it. I have what I built, I said. I've been sharing more of it than you knew. She nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that means I understand rather than I agree, which was appropriate. Agreement was not what the moment required. What it required was accuracy, and we had arrived at accuracy, and that was enough to proceed from. I told them what I was going to do, and what I was not. I was going to continue the lease through its current term, which had 14 months remaining. At the end of that term, I would assess renewal based on my own situation and give them the required notice if anything was going to change. I was going to continue covering the monthly gap through the current term. I was not going to increase my contribution. I was not going to substitute my labor for any other family member's expenses. I was available to help identify resources if the family needed practical guidance, a financial counselor, a childcare assistance program, a list of options for Petra that did not involve my resignation. My father nodded at each of these, slowly, the way he processed things that required him to revise a picture he had been carrying. My mother asked about the childcare assistance program. I told her I would look into what was available in Petra's area and send her what I found. I did this the following Wednesday. A list of 3 programs with contact information and income eligibility notes that I had compiled with help from a colleague at Varden who had been through the process herself, a woman named Ifioma Osemensa, who knew the landscape better than I did and who had spent 20 minutes on the phone with me walking through the options. Petra applied to one of the programs. It took 6 weeks to process. She was approved for a partial subsidy that covered 60% of her childcare costs for the following year. She texted me when the approval came in. The text said, "It went through. Thank you for finding it." I wrote back, "Good.
I'm glad."
The lease on Delgado Street came up for renewal 14 months later. I had been promoted at Varden by then, not to a title I would have predicted when I started, but to one that made sense when I traced the line of what I had been doing for 5 years. Senior Lease Counsel, a role that formalized the analytical work I had been doing in an unofficial capacity since my 3rd year, and that came with a corresponding compensation adjustment and a direct reporting relationship with the firm's managing partner, a precise and demanding man named Theodore Carver, who had the quality, rare in senior leadership, of being genuinely interested in whether the work was right. I renewed the Delgado Street lease. I renewed it in my name, as before, because my parents' financial picture had not changed sufficiently to qualify them independently, and because the alternative, not renewing, was not something I was willing to do. This is not a dramatic choice. It is just the choice I made, clearly and without coercion, from a position of knowing what I was choosing. I told my parents I was renewing. I told them the terms. I told them what I was covering and what I was not. It was a 5-minute conversation, factual and complete, and my father said thank you, and my mother said she was making something for Sunday and would I come, and I said yes, I would come, and I did. The Sunday dinners after that were different in the way that things are different once the true structure of them has been named out loud. Not transformed, different. The same table, the same food, the same particular quality of light in that kitchen in the late afternoon. But the underneath of it had changed. The version of me that sat at the table was accurate now, and the family was operating from accurate information, and that made the ordinary things feel less like maintenance and more like what they actually were. Petra brought her children. They ran in the yard. My mother watched them from the kitchen window with an expression that needed no translation. At Varden, Theodore Carver gave me a piece of feedback at my first formal review in the new role that I have returned to more than once. He said, "You do the work before you announce the work. Most people get that backward." He said it as an observation, not a criticism, and I understood it as both an accurate description of how I operated and a note that in the new role, the announcement would sometimes need to come first.
I have been working on that. It is not natural to me.
The habit of doing quietly and disclosing later, or not at all, was useful for a long time, and in some domains it still is. But in the role I am in now, the work benefits from being named as it happens, and I have been learning to name it in client meetings, in team check-ins, in the careful written summaries I now send Theodore at the end of each week. It is a different kind of precision from the one I developed keeping the family's housing in order while saying as little as possible about it. It is, in some ways, harder. There is a phrase that came to me on a Sunday morning in early spring, in my apartment with the window open and the coffee hot, and the city beginning its particular Sunday sound outside. The work you do in silence is still work. But silence is not the same as security, and the people who matter deserve the true picture. I spent 5 years doing real things quietly in my family because I had learned that visibility created vulnerability. What I had not fully understood was that invisibility also created the conditions for Friday night, for my sister's announcement, my father's verdict, the phone calls to my workplace, and to Halverson. The silence I had chosen to protect myself had also protected a fiction, that I was the one who didn't show up, the one who kept everything for herself, the one who needed to be called to account. The true picture ended that fiction. Not dramatically. Not in a speech. Through a property management company reading a name over the phone, and a Saturday morning at an outdoor table, and a 5-minute conversation about a lease renewal. I set my fork down and I walked out. And what came back, not because I arranged it but because the structure of the thing was already true, was a version of my family that finally knew what they were sitting in. If you've ever been the person holding something up while your family assumed someone else was doing it, I want to ask you something specific. There's a moment in this story when Halverson confirms my name on the lease to my sister, and she goes quiet for several seconds. What do you think she was doing in those seconds? Realizing something or deciding something? I think about that a lot. Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell. New stories every week, and I don't want you to miss the next one. This has been Ren's story. Thank you for the time you gave it.